What's going on, y'all? So before we get into this topic, I want to be clear about where I'm coming from, not just with this, but for the entire future of any long-form content I create around human performance and movement. I'm not a physiologist. I'm not in a lab coat. I don't claim to be a scientist in the strictest sense of the word. What I am is a sport pedagogist. My work does live at the intersection of movement, coaching, and education. So this is where science meets the art of things, where philosophy meets real bodies in real time. I've taught kinesiology and I've coached athletes for over 2 decades. I've worked with everyone from SEAL candidates to high school elite soccer players to 70-year-olds recovering from hip surgery. I've trained children and world-class performers. But more than that, I've listened, or at least I've tried to, and I know that I've failed along the way. Everyone listening has as well. I've paid attention, and I've tried to teach with as much care and clarity in a field that is increasingly full of noise. And again, I've made a lot of mistakes, and I've believed a lot of things and thought in absolutes, and I'm going to critique a lot of that today. This topic, fascia, and I'm going to call it fascia. I know some people want to call it fascia. I feel more comfortable with the ah. So this topic is fascia, movement systems, somatic language, all of that stuff is highly debated. And I think that's a beautiful thing. But what concerns me isn't that people disagree. It's that so many are speaking in absolutes and shouting people down. It's creating confusion, it's creating division, and it's fostering fear and neuroticism around something that is at its core our most natural inheritance, which is the ability to move, man. Movement isn't just something to fix. It isn't something to overthink or moralize. It's something to honor. It's something to explore, to build capacity in. So my goal here is to contribute to that conversation without shaming anyone, but I am going to call out the grifters who create chaos in this space. They deserve it, and their names should be named. So I'm not going to be coddling this nonsense. I know I could have put together a slide deck. Some of you may have expected that, or brought in fancy visuals to make this easier to consume. But I didn't want that, and I've never wanted that. And since I've taught for so long, I never found it to be very effective, and neither did my students. I wanted to sit here face to face and talk to you directly, because part of learning is learning to sit with ideas, with thoughts, with tension, without the constant stimulus, without the shortcuts. So if you're here for something real, something long form, challenging, and maybe even a little uncomfortable, welcome. This lecture isn't about being right, because I don't think that I'm right. I don't think I can be right about this specific topic or most topics in general. I believe we've got to ride the gray and laterally think our way, but it's about being honest. It's about returning to grounded, thoughtful, and embodied education in a field that desperately needs more of that. So let's talk. There's a comment that I received recently that I really haven't been able to shake, or I wasn't at the time, so I've spent a lot of time taking a deep dive. And the comment was not hostile at all. It was kind and it was informative in the best way that this person knew how to deliver the information. It was thoughtful, it was earnest, but it was still filled with some kind of half-truths that are flooding the movement space right now. So I felt it deserved far more than some sort of clapback or a carousel, or even a series of reels. It deserves a lecture. I needed to put my professor hat back on as if I was back teaching at the University of Alabama at Roll Tide to all of my students across various kinesiological subdisciplines. So the comment came in response to a pretty damn funny reel that I made that was a critique around fascia training, specifically how systems like functional patterns and GOTA, so the likes of Naughty Aguilar, the Lever King, tend to make these grand claims about fascia that aren't supported by anatomy, physiology, biomechanics, basic logic. Here's what Rachel, who's a somatic educator, wrote in response. She said, "This is true to an extent. Fascia is being trained as long as we're moving. And fascia also needs particular impulses for rebuilding, regeneration, and fluid exchange that aren't met with classic lifting, for example." She says it needs more than just to be stretched and loaded. Training fascia includes working with elastic recoil, energy storage, being able to move slowly enough to quote unquote melt through layers of fascia. She says, in parentheses, speedy HIIT workouts are limited when it comes to fascia because they're too fast. Well, there's a lot of issues with people calling things high intensity interval training when it doesn't meet the standard of really a basic formula to produce the energy system adaptations that we're after. But I digress. And she goes on to says, and working with integration along the long lines, which isolated exercises don't do. So yes, it does require a different intention and approach. So to her credit, this is certainly not a bad comment. It's very reflective. She's trying to speak from her own experiences and her training. She's doing what most of us are trying to do in this field, which is to take a very complex concept, theoretically, right, and distill it into something useful. And I respect the hell out of that. But here's the thing, what sounds poetic can still be, I hate to say wrong, but maybe it creates a little bit too much certainty and confusion around these topics. So worse, just slightly wrong in a way that slides into these dogmatic approaches when they're left unchecked. Now that sucks. So what's more is it represents an increasingly common issue in our space, just the movement space, even the wellness space as a whole. It's the co-opting of scientific sounding jargon to justify vague, unverified modalities, often by well-meaning and sometimes grifters practitioners who don't realize that they're building frameworks on shaky ground. So I want to be really clear up front. I'm not here to dismiss the lived experiences of practitioners. I love that stuff. I'm not here to mock anyone exploring somatics. I have a somatic teacher and therapist. It has absolutely changed my life. I'm so proud of the man I'm becoming because of my teacher, Tegan. Slowness, sensory-based movement. I'm never here to shame anybody. I love that stuff because I do believe in moving with intention. I do believe that different systems offer different invitations into the body. And I do believe fascia is real. We have to, responsive and important. But I'm also a doctoral student in human performance sport pedagogy. And I did get to teach this stuff and learn this stuff deeply at the university level. And I've gotten the opportunity to train athletes and soldiers and artists and professionals of all kinds. I've coached people through chronic pain and will continue to do so because most people are living with it, and peak performance. I love both. And I've lived in a body that's carried a tremendous amount of trauma, diagnosed with PTSD by 4 different practitioners, and a whole lot of triumph. So I'm not here to be some sort of armchair critic. And I cannot sit quietly while people start tossing around phrases like fascia melting on long lines of integration or training that goes deeper than lifting. I love that stuff as if it's settled fact. That's where I have the issue. Because if you're going to teach this stuff, if you're going to post it and sell it or build your method around it, you have a responsibility to get it right. Or at least, at the very least, please, we have to stay open to potentially being wrong. So this response was never about Rachel's comment. It's more so about the movement that we're seeing within the fascia sort of like agenda. This is about what her comment represents. It's the fusion of science and spirituality without really clear boundaries. And I do think we need to kind of have a discussion around the demarcation of these things. And both have a tremendous amount of value in my life. And it's how I coach. So it's the assumption that classic training, I'm not sure exactly what she thinks of as classic training, is incomplete simply because it doesn't feel poetic or it doesn't trigger the algorithm. It's the slow but real erasure of foundational principles in favor of new age branding, these marketing schemes to catch your eye and to feed your dopamine, right? These quick fixes and these quick hitters that really have no depth. And that sucks. And this is the crack in the door where these grifters will flood in. So this is how GOTA, for those of you who don't know, convince people that their walk is broken. They've called LeBron James one of the worst of all time athletes because he walks with splayed feet. How Chong Shi, and I hope I'm saying his name correctly, tells towel curls as performance breakthroughs, how functional patterns markets every other modality as outdated and dysfunctional, and how WEC method, and I've trained with functional patterns and WEC method, can turn the royal coil into a cult-like practice. So these folks, they don't just play with things like metaphor, they tend to weaponize this stuff. So what we're going to do over the next several, I guess probably about 50 minutes, is break this down line by line. So what I want to do is to look at what fascia actually is, given I understand there's a mountain of research I could dive into. I'm just a one-man research team, reading team. What fascia actually responds to, what the science currently says based on meta-analyses and various papers, where poetry belongs, because I love that, and where it needs to sit the hell down, where we're going to hold humility in one hand, but we also have to have a scalpel in the other. Because if we're going to teach people how to move, how to feel, how to live in their bodies, then we better take that responsibility seriously. This is sincere work, and it has to be filled with a lot of humor, right? So it's not with certainty, and it's not with fear, but it's with care and it's with clarity. So here's what fascia actually is and what it isn't. So we're going to take this deep dive into the tissue that everyone's talking about right now, at least in my space. I know some of y'all may only follow me as far as like human movement, but I think few of us actually truly understand it. And if we're going to speak about it, we need to understand it a little bit better. So if you're going to say you're quote unquote training fascia, we got to know what it is. Because here's what I see happening. People are tossing the word fascia around like it's some sort of magic spell. I like magic. I think it's fun. But they just use it to justify slow movement, spirals, tissue melting metaphors, and whatever else fits their aesthetic, their brand, their marketing efforts, their desire to scare you into buying their programs, their systems, right? But fascia isn't mysticism, and I love mysticism. I'm a psychonaut. Psychedelics are fun. I love that. But it's tissue, it's biology, it is matter. So we can slow down. Let's get really precise with it. So what is fascia really? Fascia is a type of connective tissue. So more specifically, it's this collagen-rich fibrous matrix that surrounds and weaves through the muscles, the bones, the nerves, the organs. It connects everything to everything. And if you got a little bit of hippie in you like I do, well, hell, you think everything's connected. Because it's kind of like this three-dimensional web that holds the body together. So there's three primary categories that have been identified with fascia. So superficial fascia is just under the skin, and it's involved in the thermoregulation and the mobility of the skin. And then you have your deep fascia, which is I think what most people are referring to when they talk about fascia training. And this surrounds the muscles, the groups of muscles and the bones. It transmits force and plays a major role in human movement. Well, just movement in general. And then you have your visceral fascia, which envelops and suspends the organs. So it's not inert, it's totally alive, it is adaptive, and it's highly innervated. And Schleep, I hope I'm saying name correctly, and colleagues emphasize that fascia is really rich in mechanoreceptors. So Ruffini endings, Pacinian corpuscles, and interstitial receptors. These are critical for proprioception and interoception. And I think some people are far too interoceptive. So interoception, which explains why many movement practices that heighten bodily awareness. So this could mean some various forms of somatics, yoga, Feldenkrais, for those of you who have dove down that rabbit hole, really cool. A lot of Ido Portal's work, I think, was born from the Feldenkrais methodology. All of them claim to be fascia focused, and they likely are. A lot of movement systems are, even classical training. In a way they are, but not in the way that a lot of people may think. So what fascia does, absolutely, what fascia does is force transmission. We can say that. And I have a list of references that I'm going to provide in the description. So fascia helps transmit force across joints and muscle groups, not just along individual muscle fibers. Fascia does of like energy storage and elastic recoil, as Rachel said. Fascia plays a role in storing and returning elastic energy, especially tendons and aponeuroses. So you can think of the stretch shortening cycles in sprinting and jumping and lifting explosively in pretty much any kind of like explosive human action, of course. And then fascia is involved in tissue integrity and structural continuity. So fascia does give structure without rigidity. And you hear a lot of practitioners, especially like body workers and the ones who make the claims of a lot of kind of slow flowing movement, will talk about that kind of stuff. And it distributes stress across tissues and protects against localized strain potentially. And fascia is involved in hydration and fluid exchange. So fascia's ground substance, specifically the extracellular matrix, plays a critical role in maintaining these sliding surfaces and allowing for this smooth gliding between tissues. I think that's where a lot of like naughty aguilar stuff comes from. And then fascia is involved in this sensory interface. So it's a communicator. It's not just a container. And I think that's where a lot of people will kind of talk about how fascia, so your trauma lives in your fascia, and it's communicating to you in a sense. So fascia has far more sensory nerve endings than muscle. I love that fact. That's really kind of cool to play with, all these various nerve endings that exist within fascia. But fascia isn't a contractile tissue. It can change tone due to embedded myofibroblasts. So I'm going to take deeper dive into tone in a later lecture, but it doesn't contract like skeletal muscle. So you're not doing bicep curls and you're not doing a bunch of flowing movement just for your fascia, of course. So fascia isn't separate from muscle. So this is where folks like functional patterns and Gotha get it wrong. You cannot specifically just train fascia. And I know that there's some prominent movement practitioners in the space that claim you can. You cannot, I don't believe you can train that. I haven't found no evidence instead of muscle. You can't just bias the fascia instead of the muscle. You influence fascia through muscle, through load, through motion. Fascia cannot be melted because that's poetic language. I love poetic language. I write a lot. What's likely happening during this quote unquote melting is more of a reduction in muscle tone, improved parasympathetic tone, and fluid redistribution in the extracellular matrix. So that's incredibly valuable. But it's not melting fascia like it's wax or it's cheese. That's not a real thing. But I understand like the need to use poetic language. I love that and I value it deeply. And fascia isn't a secret pathway. It's not a shortcut to mystical athleticism, for God's sakes. It's part of the system. You can't just quote unquote unlock fascia and bypass all the boring stuff like progressive overload, really good sleep, or just tissue tolerance, and developing a ton of skills. So here's how fascia responds to training. And the spoiler alert is you're already training it, like if you're training. So plyometric training directly targets fascia's elastic properties with eccentrics and tempo work of various kinds, but specifically more so focused on slow eccentrics and slow tempo work. It increases time under tension and it builds connective tissue strength. And I often utilize this to support people's tendon health. Various forms of isometrics. So whenever we're using isometrics, you can be targeting all sorts of different types of tissues, and it's going to improve tendon stiffness with that yielding isometrics a lot of times, and connective tissue loading capacity. Fascia is going to be involved in that, with various forms of loaded carries and sled work and ballistics. This is going to stimulate these full body chains and force transfer across these fascia lines. So you don't need a special spiral movement or a spiritual cueing language to train fascia. You just need to load your body with intention, but with actual tension. So the bottom line is that fascia is real, of course. It is trainable, but it's misunderstood because it's not mystical. It's not passive, but it's also not this separate magical tissue you need a trademark spiral system to access. So the next time someone says that I'm a fascia specialist, you've got to ask them to show you the research. But this is where they get really scared. This is where they tend to cut you off. and they start to play this martyrdom role. No, you just don't understand me. They gaslight you. That's disgusting. So if you ask them what kind of load and what type of tissue, what adaptation timeline, they're going to get wide-eyed. And they start talking about energy fields, maybe. I believe in energy fields. Every single time I go out in the mountains, and specifically when I was at Yosemite, oh my goodness, whole energy shifts, right? If y'all been to places like Ojai and Sedona, Arizona, Joshua Tree, you felt it before. But I digress. Can you actually train fascia? And if so, how? So I'm going to offer more of like this no bullshit breakdown of what fascia training really can look like. This is just examples, and how much of what's being sold is either just recycled or straight up nonsense. So if you're watching this lecture, you're reading along, first of all, I'd appreciate it if you like and subscribe and share it with your friends. You've likely heard people say things like, this method trains fascia, not muscle. You need to move slowly to melt through layers. Classic lifting, traditional lifting, power lifting, weightlifting doesn't touch the fascia system, and men like Naughty Aguilar claim it is absolutely wrong and destructive and brutal on the body. If you're a buffoon, it can be. We train along the long lines, not in isolation, is what they'll say. Along these fascial slings, these cross-body slings. Okay, so this isn't just Rachel's comment, because this is a growing zeitgeist in the movement culture in general. Fascia as this final frontier, as if everyone else has been doing it wrong, and those who know, usually the person with a new course or a $1,000 certification they're offering, have finally somehow cracked the code. And if somebody tells you they've cracked the code, you gotta run. I have utter disdain for people who say they've cracked the code of anything in this life. Jesus. So we got to tackle this head on. Can you actually, quote unquote, train fascia? And if so, what does that mean in real physiological terms? So we've got to define what training is. To train a tissue means to apply a stimulus that causes it to adapt. That's simple. That's it. That's what it is. So whether that stimulus is mechanical, so you load, chemical to cause inflammatory responses, or neural, so motor control, motor adaptations, motor skill learning, right? All of this requires adaptation, specific inputs over time. So this is that SAID principle, the specific adaptation to impose demands. This is day one type stuff in kinesiology. So the question becomes, does fascia adapt to training inputs? Yes, of course it does. But it's not special, and it sure as hell isn't immune to the same principles that govern muscle and tendon and bone. So how fascia responds to load. Fascia, especially this deep fascia, which I think most people are referring to when they talk about it, and these tendon-like structures, responds to three main types of mechanical stress. So tension, stretch, plus the load. Fascia responds to sustained tension, whether that's from long duration isometric holds potentially, slow eccentrics, time under tension, or really rapid training in sports performance training, strength training, your traditional strength conditioning stuff, personal training. If you're moving your body, you're training your fascia. Again, tempo squats, split squats, yielding isometrics. This is all effective. The adaptations with all of this stuff are going to be improved collagen alignment, the hydration of the ground substance that we talked about earlier, increased tensile strength. So again, I'm going to provide references based on what I found in the research that brilliant scientists have done. I love science. So sick of people despising science. This whole Maha movement to just completely outright rule out science in favor of a belief and faith. That's insane. It's also like you've got to have elastic load and recoil. So fascia stores and releases energy, especially in these ballistic and plyometric movements. So this is that stretch shortening cycle. So preload, absorb, explode. So you can think of that as often people in my space describe as like a rubber band. So if you don't stretch it, it's not going to snap back. So training here could include various forms of intensive and extensive plyometrics. So bounding, sprinting, med ball throws, Olympic lifts, kettlebell swings. And then more so with this fascia training, if you want to think of fascia training, you have shear and multiplanar stress. So fascia isn't just stressed, obviously. Like this is where a lot of people are building their systems around, that fascia training, that it's not just stressed in linear planes. It experiences shear when layers of tissue will glide against each other. I think that's what these people are talking about. So rotation, spirals, lateral movement, they all help here. So this is where Landmine University was born, right? These various forms of landmine rotations, a lot of maybe the animal flow system, so the crawling, club swings. A lot of people really love mace work. Even like a lot of the kind of the kettlebell juggling and play, and a lot of martial arts, but that's sport in general. If you're playing sport, you're moving in multiple planes of motion. So these are powerful in loading tissue in 3 dimensions, but I could also just be a soccer coach and say, well, this is a fascia training system. Same for tennis, any non-traditional or traditional sport. So the translation really is that you're already training your fascia, if you're moving at all, really, but hopefully you're moving well. Because you don't need a new method to train your fascia. You need load, you need variety and intent and rhythm. And I'll take deeper dives into what I mean by rhythm with maybe some later lectures or at least content on Instagram or TikTok. So you need to train across speeds because and you need to train across speeds with both internal control and elastic explosion. You need to explore end ranges under tension. This is with weight, with the breath, truly understanding the breath with time. So yes, fascia training, quote unquote, is very real, but the people who actually understand fascia aren't the ones selling it like it's a proprietary method. They're the ones coaching sled pushes, tempo deadlifts, long duration isometrics, Zercher squats, box jumps, extensive and intensive plyometrics, contralateral carries, right? Sprint mechanics, but don't think this is where a lot of coaches get it wrong. Like most of us in the sports performance space aren't good enough to coach track sprinting, but I do think we likely have a keen enough eye with team and individual sport. If you're using yielding and overcoming isometrics, ground flow and rotational drills, like they're all involved, but all of the above is involved. So the real professionals that I look up to, they're blending all of these tools. So most of the people listening to me right now, the reason why we're attracted to a guy like Austin Yoakum's work is because it's what he does. And he argues for that. Joel Smith. And then you have so many different practitioners. If y'all don't follow Evie Calderon, you should, who utilize this type of stuff. So they're blending the tools, but they're not trademarking fascia and just various forms of tension. So what's not real fascia training? We've got to be really clear about what's not effective fascia training. Elevated heel towel curls, Chong Shi. Again, I hope I'm getting his name right. If not, it's not out of outright disrespect. I've never heard someone use his name before. There's absolutely no evidence for any of the work he espouses that this isolates or activates, quote unquote, fascia in any meaningful way at all. It's asinine to make that claim. What fascia training is not is swinging your arms and spiraling your tibias and internally rotating here, tucking your elbow into your lat while standing in this Weck method coil. That improves coordination, I suppose. Sure, I've used it for several years, actually. Found nothing in it. But that's not fascia loading. That's a choreography drill. And hell, I love choreography. I love watching people dance. And I really feel like I missed out on hip hop dance and ballet. Maybe in my 40s, I'll get to enjoy that. What fascia is not, fascia gliding, quote unquote, through soft waving motions without tension. I think what people were experiencing is like, this does feel really good. I use it. I have something I call willow tree practice. It down regulates the nervous system, but without sufficient mechanical load, it does not remodel fascia in the way that plyometrics or heavy eccentrics or just lifting in general do. So what's actually happening when people say they're melting fascia? They're probably improving their interoception. So this felt sense in the body, they're developing an awareness, and that is like a embodied education for yourself. That's awesome. they're enhancing fluid dynamics in that extracellular matrix, which I think I've mentioned a couple times already before. They are activating the parasympathetic nervous system, which a lot of people are kind of living in this sort of fight, flight, flee, which, you know, I know many of y'all refer to it as that. They're releasing habitual motor holding patterns. So a lot of these practices, rather than being, we shouldn't maybe call them fascia training, it's just developing this understanding of the body and kind of telling the body a new narrative. It may be holding on to patterns that that you no longer need, that no longer serve your body, but is kind of stuck. And this is where it gets difficult, and the research is somewhat limited. So I love that, and I think that's so damn cool, and that's valuable, but none of that is direct fascial adaptation. From what I am gathering, it's more of a neural response. Again, this is what my interpretation is, and I want to keep the distinction really clear here. So we can respect the tissue and we respect the process. To quote unquote train fascia is to train with intention, but that intention must be paired with a stimulus, with repeatability, with load. And then what is very important to me, even though I know it's not important to most people in the movement space right now, which is difficult because you have a lot of these science-based bros that aren't scientific at all and that are truly creating a lot of problems for those who do value legitimate science. Real evidence, and no one in exercise science field or across kinesiological subdisciplines or molecular biology, like all of these different fields that all of us will study if you've been coaching for a really long time, none of them have this agenda to confuse people. It is difficult to do research. I don't know how many of y'all have had to try and get a study through the, IRB and then get all of these edits sent back to you to finally get your paper published. And that is a slow process. And sometimes it is too bureaucratic. And sometimes we are limited by what we can study based on compliance and the amount of people we can actually get into the study. But it's rare that these things are funded by anything but a hard-earned grant. So I digress. So when we're talking about this intention, pairing it with stimulus, and we're trying to get really real about this stuff, this is how we honor the body. It's not by treating it like a mystery, and it is a mystery, but it's by learning how it adapts and creating a practice around that understanding as best we can. So there's some other movements that are popping up and that are becoming increasingly more popular, and I think they have tremendous value, and then we need to name them though. So human design, one of them, somatics, and the search for meaning in movement, and some of my favorite papers in sport pedagogy tackle this subject of meaning making in movement, and a lot of them are born out of Australia, so it's no surprise that a lot of the people I really love in the movement space are actually from Australia. So this is why we reach for maps and what we lose when we mistake a map for the actual terrain that we're on. So at some point, if you've spent enough time moving or lifting or rehabbing your mind, your body, your soul, especially after pain or burnout, you'll start asking these big questions. You go from, what should I do for my shoulder, to why do I always push through pain, to what kind of mover am I really, to who the hell am I when I'm not training? Like when we form this identity around a specific method or just our training in general. I don't believe training means you were born in the darkness. A lot of people kind of put on this villain hat when they enter into the weight room, take way too much stimulants and go wild, just view their entire training methodology as their identity. This is where people start reaching for something more layered than sets and reps. A lot of us do. Those especially interested in kind of philosophy beyond, the physiology of things. So lately, one of the more popular frameworks that are continuously showing up, specifically in Substacks and longer form content in the movement world, in the wellness space, in the psychological, psychotherapy space, is human design. So if you haven't heard of it, human design, from what I've read, is it blends astrology, the I Ching, the chakra system, Kabbalah, some quantum physics sounding language, and a whole lot of metaphor. And it gives people types, these kind of like archetypes. So you're a generator, you're a projector, you're a manifester, etc. These energetic blueprints and decision-making strategies born from this. So some practitioners are using this to guide training decisions, claiming they can use it for business strategies and just life in general, and how they communicate with their clients. So I believe this resonates because people are actually really tired, because training can feel really transactional, and so can a lot of various therapies, especially cognitive behavioral therapy, kind of just feel like you're on the clock. Because people don't want to just be reduced to VO2 max, which if y'all haven't listened to Steve Magnus talk about kind of the lack of importance of VO2 max, please do. I have so much love for that guy because he does ride the gray, and he plays a great game of devil's advocate, even with himself. And I found that his text, The Science of Running, to be one of the most valuable things I've ever read, not just because it's about running, but it's really cool to see a brilliant mind sort of waffle at times and be uncertain. And I think that that's cool. So people don't want to be reduced to their 1 rep maximums. They want to feel seen and felt and understood. And I get that completely because I've been there and I'm always there, I think. The grind, the hyper objective stuff. I'm concerned about the outputs and the outcomes. This no rest days aesthetic. Eventually you realize your nervous system is absolutely shot and it's trying to speak to you because it does have a say. And so people, myself included, might turn to human design or somatic based coaching like I did. And we're often doing so because no one taught us how to interpret the body's more subtle signals. And that is valuable work because we've got to give credit where it's due. These frameworks offer people like you and me language for self-awareness. It invites true introspection, reflection, talking to yourself. And placebos and the power of belief in what you tell yourself is undefeated, man. All of this will soften these edges of this optimization culture because they say maybe there's not one right way to be in your body. Hell yes to that. And that's a beautiful offering, especially in a field as judgmental as the health and fitness space has really become. Because here's the problem, when people really start replacing physiology with philosophy, things can get messy. And I try to do this all the time, but it is a struggle because the lines can kind of get blurred and it becomes a little bit unclear. And hopefully you are a little bit uncertain and you start to learn to not speak in definitives. But when a coach says, I'm a projector, so I don't do high intensity work, or you're a projector, you shouldn't do that, that's not insight. That's a new form of avoidance. And I've worked with and been friends with people that will avoid things like really rapid movement because that's not good for their body. And I believe that you have to kind of play this yin and yang. And I'm often in my own programming, in my own life, and with many of my clients, more so training 10-day rhythms and thinking of our weeks like 10 days, where we can kind of undulate through high levels of intensity and then high levels of beautiful recovery. So when someone skips progressive overload because their chart says they're in a low energy season, we tend to replace this one rigid system, maybe with physical culture, strength culture, movement culture, with another one that can be kind of like this woo-woo culture. And I like the woo, I like all that stuff. But that's the paradox, because these same frameworks that can help us reclaim our agency initially, if we get too attached to this stuff, if we get too bound to this stuff, it becomes a prison of our own making. And so far, human design isn't science, and that's okay. But we can't pretend otherwise, because as of now, on this day, June 13th, 2025, there's no peer-reviewed data validating human design, and I value peer-reviewed data. Maybe you don't, and you can stop listening now. There's no double-blind study, really important, showing that generators respond better to things like CrossFit, or that projectors need, quote-unquote, more yin. That does not make it useless, but it does mean that we've got to be really honest. What human design can be is a metaphor, a lens, a personal mythology, I think those may be things we are missing from our lives, the mythos of our lives. It helps people attune to their body, communicate potentially better with their clients, sit better in communication with things, or just be a little less hard on themselves and others, and that has tremendous value. But metaphors don't replace movement principles, and astrology doesn't replace anatomy. And again, that's okay. And if you follow astrology and you love metaphor, awesome. I see value in it too. Never want to rule something completely out. It's all interesting, right? You got to be interesting. Same goes for somatic therapy. So somatics, think about it in this broad sense here, it's any practice that centers this internal sensing. And that has exploded lately. And I think that's cool because people are talking about melting and unwinding and liberating the spine. For liberating a spine. So somatic movement classes will guide people through various spiraling actions and gentle flows and emotional release techniques, which I've experienced many, many times. And again, this is incredibly valuable, especially for trauma-informed care, especially for this nervous system regulation. So somatics used in the broad sense here as any practice that centers, internal sensing. All of that stuff has exploded lately, and I think that's really cool because people are talking about melting and unwinding and liberating the spine. And again, I think that's important to kind of give people these visual cueing, these metaphorical cues. They're fun, right? I think it's rad. Somatic movement classes are going to guide people through varying spiral actions and gentle flows. And I've been in some where we crawl around like animals and bark and howl and emotional release techniques. Again, I think all that stuff's really valuable. You can even think about some of this stuff is like some of, ecstatic dancing, right? And all of that's great for trauma-informed care. I needed it myself, especially for nervous system regulation. But we've got to be really, really clear here. Somatics, from what I'm gathering, is more so neurocognitive training, and it's not this structural remodeling. So I've tried. You can't, quote unquote, release your psoas by imagining light there. You can't realign your fascia by sighing through your feet. And feelings are valid, but claims about a tissue adaptation and change need evidence. So here's where I stand with all of this. I don't hate human design. I certainly don't hate somatics. And I don't think you're wrong if you've found a tremendous amount of power in these approaches, because I have. But I do get genuinely very suspicious when someone starts preaching these frameworks as if they're more true than well-researched, time-tested principles. And again, I understand that research can be flawed and that it can be frustrating and that it might be very difficult to create research out of some of these theories. But let's leave it at that. They are theories. Therefore, there are thoughts and our opinions and our beliefs and our perspectives that blend into our practice. And this is the same kind of certainty that the fitness world is drowning in. It's just dressed in more of a softer aesthetic. So if you're a coach or a teacher or a guide, mentor of any kind, your job is not to sell certainty and sometimes not to sell safety. Your job is to invite exploration and help others learn to listen without losing the signal in the noise. So study your charts and feel your fascia, but never stop asking, is this real? Is this helping? Or is this just my new identity costume? That's important. We don't need to throw out mystery, but we've got to keep mystery relatively honest, and we need to keep our magic somewhat grounded. So I'm going to move into something that's maybe a little more call out culture, because I think this is important. The rise of the certainty merchants. So AKA, I call this middle finger to the gurus. This is why I believe naming names matters and how weaponized language is ruining movement culture, or just this conviction language. You can have your values and all of that stuff, and you can have your principles, but to speak with outright conviction about things, it's shaky ground. And we don't need to tiptoe around this stuff. There's a reason people are confused, and there's a reason trainers and students and clinicians, practitioners alike are getting pulled in so many different directions. And it's because the movement world, and especially the online side of things, the social media space, and its need to create headlines, we've become more algorithm than we practice being a human. It's being overrun by these certainty merchants, aka grifters. These are the ones who speak in absolutes. These are the ones who claim every other system is broken. These are the ones who weaponize their charisma, sometimes lack thereof. They spit half-truths at you, and they wrap it all in this super seductive packaging of, I figured out what no one else could. And I watched Nadi Aguilar do that in the comment section of my friend Alex Sterner recently, where he says he's doing stuff no one's ever thought of. It's playing God. It's really bizarre to watch someone have like megalo. So while I'm all for exploring various models and tools and all sorts of different traditions, Western and Eastern, I'm going to draw a really hard line at this kind of cult-like marketing, because this isn't education, it's outright manipulation. And so I want to name some names. And I will say that the only one I have like somewhat love for would be David Weck. He's just a fascinating character. And those of you who followed him long enough know that he's experienced and is very open about various kind of mental health struggles in his life. And he's a curious character, and I think in some ways he's been good for the movement space. But Nadi Aguilar, Functional Patterns, isn't a good human being. And this is the man who built an entire brand on the premise that your training is making you dysfunctional. And that Nadi Aguilar, aka the Lever King, and his whole crew of sycophants are known for this aggressive anti-everything posturing. Olympic lifting is bad. And he especially loves to highlight women doing Olympic lifting. And I think some of y'all might want to take a deep dive into how weird this man is when it comes to the opposite sex. Yoga is bad. Strength sports of any kind, they're idiotic. And CrossFit is just a circus act. And all the things I just listed off, number one, every single one of those movement practices carries with it a community of people. And in a world where a lot of people are struggling, specifically men, with loneliness, and we're in Men's Mental Health Month this month of June, I think community matters a whole lot. It adds a lot of value to a life far beyond the physiological adaptations you gain from those things and the very real physiological adaptation that give you freedom and liberation and move your body in a beautiful way to enjoy this life, this one precious life. So unless you're doing Nadi's very specific sequence of cables and bands and barefoot spirals while yelling something about the gait cycle, you're a degenerate, and I love being a degenerate who's slowly wrecking your joints. Yeah, I mean, you can go too far with any movement practice, including his. Functional Patterns is built on this idea that there's one right way to move. And surprise, it just happens to be what they teach. But here's the problem with that. Their claims are massive and their evidence is microscopic, meaning there's none there, and he will acknowledge that. He says it's coming. No, it's not. There are no peer-reviewed studies backing their assertions. No one will do a peer-reviewed study because Nadi actually doesn't want anyone to critique his work. There's no long-term data proving their method is superior. I mean, if I can't find a broad meta-analysis, I'm skeptical. You should be too. And stop being so damn skeptical of exercise scientists. These people don't have an agenda. They're just trying to enjoy the life of teaching exercise science and understanding what's really going on in the deeper layers of the human body. My goodness. None of my colleagues and friends have nefarious ideas in mind. So every attempt at critique of functional patterns is met with anger first. He's very angry, weird little man. Deflection. And if you're a small person, I'm sorry about that. Insults. I just insulted him, but he kind of deserves it. Or appeals to his own authority. And he's turned gait, like Goethe has, into a religion, like Weck has as well. And Nadi, he's not just teaching, he's preaching, and He's this kind of crazed maniac in the bully pulpit. If he really cared about the craft of movement, he'd subject his own method to independent scrutiny. But instead, every single time he plays this martyr role where he says, we're ahead of our time. That's why everyone misunderstands us. That's not innovation. That's called delusion. That's a grifter. It's grandiose narcissism at play. And that's scary. We have enough of that in this world, far beyond the movement space. Chong Shi, again, apologies if I'm saying his name wrong, but I'm going to call him out. It's hyperarch fascia training. This is the towel curl prophet himself. So he claims that you can train your fascia through foot gripping, elevated heel curls, and special HFT swings that mimic elite athlete movement patterns. Success leaves clues with elite athlete movement patterns, but what makes an elite athlete is what really surprises us when they respond to something in a way that we would have never been able to do before. It's the invention and the innovation, the improv on the fly. He claims his methods unlock hidden fascial lines that no other training touches, and he implies often explicitly that most athletes are misfiring unless they train his way. He shows videos of LeBron or Kyrie and says, see, that's my method in action. What a turd. I mean, that's just shocking to me when coaches do that. Let's get really clear. This is classic pseudoscientific bait and switch. This is what Goethe does as well. This is what Naughty does. This is what a lot of people, even in the knees over toes space, do. I think Ben Patrick's an interesting character. I think a lot of his sycophants are problematic, and I didn't necessarily call them out here. They deserve their own lecture. So here's that bait and switch. Show an elite movement. Claim you know the secret to that elite movement, or you know how to prevent it an injury in an elite athlete. It just produces more force than you can even fucking imagine. Package it into an obscure drill that's hard to test and even harder to refute. That sounds an awful lot like Gish Gallop tactics in debates, or, currently what most of the politicians across the world do. There is zero, absolutely no published research validating his methodology. So you got to take his word for it. His explanations misuse anatomical terms. His drills that he utilizes lack any sort of logical progression, any load variables, or any sense of adaptational stress. So if you have faith in the system, okay, again, faith, belief matters. If you believe you can do something that's fixing you, well, you've placeboed yourself, and that's great. What he does have is aesthetics and vague Eastern references and buzzwords like fascia recoil or a neural fascial loop or an activation of the internal spring. That's called branding, and that's a false bravado, and it's dangerous nonsense. So I do want to speak about David Weck, and again, I've already highlighted that I find him to be a fascinating character in the space, and he's created a following of people that pretend to know what he's talking about. I don't know how anybody follows along. And please let me tell you that I believe Chris Chamberlain, his sidekick, is one of the strongest human beings I've ever seen in my life, and his feats of strength are undeniable. So I also believe that Chris could have trained in a multitude of other ways that are out there in this world and gotten the same results, even maybe potentially better. But he's a multi-modality kind of guy anyway, beyond just the Weck method. So within the Weck method, it's a really popular system, especially amongst Instagram influencers, and even a couple of the people that I train like it. And they film themselves on Bosu balls and internally rotating into kind of these royal coils, what they've marketed it as, using shakers to downward pulse into the ground for better running. And they talk about these rotational slings like they've discovered kinetic chains, like some new form of kinetic chain. And Weck has offered really useful, I think, patterns related to more contralateral movement. And even, a lot of practitioners I have a tremendous amount of respect for will talk about the importance of kind of contralateral and more unilateral movement, and how that tends to help people become better movers who haven't moved a lot before giving them bilateral movement. And I think I can mostly agree with that to an extent, although I use a lot of strategies myself in my practice that are quite interesting in bilateral patterns. We'll move into more of the WEC again. So he's brought a lot of play into the scene, and hell yeah to that. But a lot of his followers and sycophants, they've turned these like coaching tools into this more like a theology of spirals in a sense. You'll see it. They always put like the DNA logo, or emoji into their captions. You are not a more quote unquote natural mover because you have a band attached around your foot with a landmine. You're not a superior coach because you're bouncing and spinning maniacally and reciting head over foot. I think this is like this neurological cosplay. You look coordinated, that's awesome. But oftentimes it's hard to maybe progress some of these systems. It hasn't stood the test of any sort of rigorous research. And I don't really quite understand the dynamic correspondence or the transfer to sport that they claim, because there's plenty of real evidence where I've seen the greatest athletes on the planet use the most basic sports performance training and are absolute athletic, unbelievably coordinated geniuses on the court, the field, right? The pitch. So this isn't fascia training. I think sometimes it can be performative novelty. Here's who I have a massive issue with most often is outside of functional patterns and Changxi is Gota. So these are the footage prophets. And to their credit, I've seen them with some of my friends, at least some of their practitioners go on to podcasts and attempt to debate it. So this is a system that claims to have reverse engineered the ideal gait by watching slow motion clips of Usain Bolt, jungle cats, and toddlers learning how to walk. Massive mistake looking at toddlers as if adults can move like a toddler. Things fuse together. They believe that all injury and dysfunction and pain comes from having your inside ankle bone low. Okay. And they believe that outside ankle bone high is the holy grail. We'll even see practitioners like Bobby Stroop, who trains Patrick Mahomes, utilize some of this stuff. They demonize lifting and loaded hinges and things like knees over toes, who I think we've heard enough from, and anything that challenges their model in a sense. So to be fair, Gota does have a point when it comes to observational patterns in elite movers. Again, success leaves clues, but they confuse correlation with causation. So you end up with everyone I just named, it's this post hoc fallacy. And worse, they blame injury on anyone who doesn't conform to their template. And that's disgusting. That's not a system anymore. That's a purity test. So this matters a lot. And it's not just a movement beef of some kind. It's about ethics, because these systems are often shaming people out of methods that work. They prey on people's fears and confusion and their pain and their desire to improve their lives. They offer certainty where nuance is required, and a tremendous amount of case studies exist within the coaching world to suggest that our greatest adaptations happen when we consider nuanced practices based on the athletes that are in front of us. So rather than sometimes viewing a bunch of meta-analyses or specific research papers and trying to apply the data, specifically some of the quantitative data, to the individual in front of you, you tend to see that person as an outcome and an output and a metric rather than a soul. And I believe in seeing the soul. A lot of this stuff replaces education with indoctrination. And for many of them, but specifically functional patterns and Changxi, it punishes inquiry and rewards your obedience. And that, my friends, is truly fucked up, because this industry is full of people in pain. And these people are desperate to feel good in their bodies again. These people may have been burned by physical therapists that stopped learning after university. They may be shamed by doctors. This happens all the time. They may have been abandoned by coaches even. But when you exploit that for attention and influence or money, you're not a guide, you're an absolute parasite. So here's what I really think we need instead. And I understand that all of this may have been self-indulgent on my part. I have to be aware of that because I have a mouthpiece right now. We do need humility and we do need nuance and we need real conversations around so many of the topics that we put out there into the ether. We need real conversation, and it's not algorithmic posturing. You don't need to believe that systems like PRI, ENS, WEC, or human design is absolute garbage. You just don't need to hold on to these things so tightly, because truly this entire game of being a human being is just one big hypothesis, and it is all in the journey. You need to stay curious, and you need to keep learning. So if someone's trying to convince you that they've got the answer to all of your problems, you should run. You should run really fast. So here's what students, because I'm an educator, a long-term educator, and I love teaching and sit in deep consideration of young people and how we influence them, because there's a lot of brilliant young people that want to get involved in the movement space, or there's a lot of people that are leaving behind careers they never loved in the first place and are becoming coaches. And one of the things that's truly lacking is better debate strategies, a pedagogical understanding at all. We'd never really teach like true pedagogy, how to teach movement. So here's what students and movers, I think they actually need. So we got to reclaim some of the essentials, because a real practice doesn't require you becoming a brand or obsessing over a brand or attaching yourself to a specific brand, a person, right? A lot of people are becoming more so brands than humans. So after all that, after naming those grifters, after dismantling some of the pseudoscience and actually looking what fascia really is, what it isn't, how to train it, how you can't, and exposing these certainty cults, we got to come to these actual questions. So what do students need? What do movers need? What should you, me, us as coaches, as teachers, or self-directed athletes, or just movers in general, actually build your training on? So the answer that most people really don't want to hear is that there is no system that will save you, but it is that you tried many systems and you thrust yourself deep down rabbit holes that you got to remember to spiral back out. But there's no spiral, and there's no fascia line, and there's no foot posturing, whether it's early or mid stance. There's no astrology reading that will make your body bulletproof or more enlightened. Again, it's all in the journey, but there are very basic principles and truths that we can hold. And this is across disciplines and bodies and sports and injuries. And the thing is that none of this is sexy, but it's incredibly sacred. So we can go through this stuff. Load will always be the king. Not load as ego lifting, but hell, to all my buddies out there, I love some ego lifting from time to time. And shit, man, if you get hurt trying something cool, at least you are being a human being and not a scared person. Load is in progressive adaptation to stress. If you want stronger tendons, you better load it. If you want healthier joints, you have to load it. It can't just be done through controlled articular rotations in the FRC system. If you want to build a resilient fascial system, then you've got to load it. If you want to protect your spine and grow your capacity and move through fears, you guessed it, you've got to load it. You can spiral, you can sway, you can breathe, you can chant, you can ecstatic dance. All of those may support your nervous system, but they don't replace mechanical stress. They do not replace progressive overload, periodized intention. And you can play with so many different periodization systems: undulating, conjugate, triphasic, French contrast, and strength as a practice. So Schoenfield and his colleagues back in 2010 laid out the foundational mechanisms of things like hypertrophy, which is mechanical tension and metabolic stress and muscle damage. And you don't get those from metaphor, but you also, all of what I just named, like the hypertrophy stuff, that's how you often get flexibility or any adaptation you seek in your body. You don't get it from metaphor, you actually get it from doing the work. And as one of my favorite quotes from one of my athletes, Ashton, said, people get so obsessed and caught in the weeds with all this stuff. And he goes, have you ever thought about just doing the work? God, I love that. I'll always remember that. And he does the work. So the second point is motor learning requires context and not just cues. Oftentimes in my career, I've found that if I'm just quiet and I create better context and environments, that provides the best stimulus anyway. You don't become a better mover by watching videos of jungle cats, even though they do serve to inspire me. And I even called some of my programming jungle cat training, or toddlers walking, or even like the spinal engine theory stuff. You become a better mover by being put in environments that require adaptability and coordination and constraint negotiation and intent. This is the ecological dynamics framework, the dynamic systems theory, the constraints-led approach, the nonlinear pedagogy. You play games. There's nothing better in this world than various forms of tag games. All you have to do is dust off old school physical education text, skill acquisition drills, if you will, tons of variability and tons of opportunity for unstructured play, because most people, even our youth, don't find themselves in environments for unstructured play. And when we become adults, we just throw it out the friggin' window and we go to Planet Fitness and run through their circuit training. Oh my God. We forgot how to play, and play should be hard and it should be competitive. We shouldn't rule out like the desire to win. That's not a capitalist driven thing. That's existed in the human condition since day fucking one. So don't outright dismiss aggressive desires to be a competitive human being. That's a topic for another day. Coaching must require a learning loop and not a repeat after me model. And sure, I love both sides of the spectrum within value orientations, where we'll look at, well, I'll just briefly name them because I'm going to talk about them much longer form soon enough. That's what my dissertation is on. But on one end of the spectrum of value orientations, what coaches value is disciplinary mastery, aka you really want them to understand and be able to execute tactics and techniques at a really high level. This can often become far too dogmatic because you believe that your specific tactics and your specific techniques fit every single person in every single sporting context. That's where it's problematic. Then you have ecological integration on the opposite end of that spectrum, where you might be using human movement to develop kind of better global citizens. You may be exploring non-traditional sport to teach different cultures. And a lot of that may be able to show someone who they actually are, but that can become a little too woo-woo. And again, where some of the physiology trying to fit physiology and philosophy into one practice can become a little bit messy, and it's something that I struggle with. So between that, is learning process and self-actualization and social responsibility. So I'm naming that now so you know what may be coming into the future. And coaches will use all sorts of various pedagogical strategies they may not even know about, whether it's directed instruction, so practice and command styles, or indirect instruction, where you more so leave it at the player's feet or in their hands or in their minds and their souls. And this quote-unquote corrective exercise is often just this learned helplessness wrapped in bands and buzzwords. I hate that. You don't need more clamshells. You should probably do a really cool, heavy-loaded go-bell squat, strongman style. We need more motor exposures. We don't need micromanagement. And, some of my favorite works have come from researchers like Renshaw and Chow with constraints-led approach, or Wolf and Luthwaite with these external focuses on improving motor learning. So, these athletic skills model, nonlinear pedagogical styles, ecological dynamics, the constraints-led approach, it's all beautiful stuff. And if you're really good at, coaching within groups, you might expose them to a lot of different games, and then you turn that invention of games over to them, where they're creating their own rules and boundaries with various implements and tools and balls and all that stuff. It's awesome. They create their own point scoring systems. These are things that we all did when we were younger in past generations that sort of left us, in kind of the 2010s and beyond. So, another thing that we can look at here is like when we're talking about, just the basic principles, is your breath and rest and regulation. That's not an option. We do need to heal or integrate in a constant state of activation. That's where most of my adult clients really struggle. But then they can't take time. This is what they feel they can't do. Recovery is never a weakness, and your breath practice is certainly not fluff, because breathing drills are, amazing, but they're not a replacement for overall ecological entanglement of a lifestyle hygiene. You can't just nervous system your way out of poor sleep or no sunlight, getting outside, in nature, hearing bird song, or a body that never stops trying to perform. If you want to train fascia or the nervous system or quote unquote the long lines, that's cool. But first, you're going to have to learn how to recover. And I have a lot of rituals built around that. And I think every athlete, any high performer I've ever seen, has journaling practices and various rituals, whether that's through reading or sitting with a warm cup or something like that, where they kind of return back to themselves. And they usually don't create a ton of checklists around their recovery. They just literally do nothing. The most elite athletes I've ever been around just don't do anything. So another thing we can talk about is consistency is often greater than complexity early on, and then you can get more complex. So always think of like early on as a lot of exploration, so you can throw a good many things at them in complexity. Then you kind of start to harness and expand specific skill sets. Then that kind of empowers and evolves that person. Then you can start to play with complexity and kind of come back into that. So it can be undulating. But oftentimes, the more elaborate a system is, the more likely it exists to hide from like the basics. So we don't need to fall into this trap of needing 1,000 different angles or bands or vocabulary terms if you haven't even understood a hinge, a squat, various locomotor patterns. So you're bounding, you're skipping, you're galloping, obviously various forms of running. So, your acceleration, your max velocity, all that stuff. And then just various forms of tempo, pushing and pulling and carrying, and then breathing and truly learning how to breathe to expand the pelvis and the diaphragm and the rib cage, and to not allow that stuff to get so high or to just mouth breathe in general. And we got to layer all of this intention on top, right? Then you layer various tempos and vectors and speeds and chaos and loads and stillness. Standing practice is beautiful. You don't need to be a biomechanist to become free in your body. You do need to show up consistently. So that's where it sucks. It's like people get so confused in their eye and they get distracted that they can't even show up consistently. They get confused. Am I doing this right? Are you moving? Yeah, you're probably doing it right. If it doesn't make me cringe, which it rarely does, you're probably moving right. That's what I tell my clients. So we got to show up consistently with awareness and progression. So my fifth point here with the basic principles is your training should make you more adaptable, not more fragile. Nocebos don't belong here. Neuroticism doesn't belong here. If a method or a person tells you that lifting in any way is dangerous, that jumping, moving in any way is unsafe, and that your spine shouldn't flex, and that your knees shouldn't go past your toes, and I think we've heard enough of both of those things by now, and that your body is broken unless it fits their specific models, you've got to walk away from them. They do not have your best interests. They see you as a system, as a metric, as an output, as an outcome, as someone that makes them feel better. You are not a problem to be fixed. You are not a dysfunction to be diagnosed. You are a human system. That's it. You're a human. You're meant to move. You're meant to load and play and explore and rest. Rebuild, adapt. Real training will liberate you. It builds tremendous capacity. It will show you unknown things, things you had yet to discover. That's what great coaches and guides do. They've given me that. And some were my last coach, in certain sports. It made me feel tied up and bound to something, and ideas that didn't fit with my body. And it gives you more choices. That's what great training does. Never fewer, never outlawing something. So what do students need? They need a coach who asks better questions. They need a teacher who asks better questions. All of us are teachers who call ourselves coaches. So they need educators who value the process more than their branding. They need reps. They need rest. They need freedom. They need form. They need science, and they need the soul. What they don't need is another smug guru pointing to someone running fast on Instagram saying, see, that's what my system does. I'm solely responsible for this genetic freak that I'm coaching. The likes of Tony Holler will do that as well. I have real issue with Feed the Cat system. We'll talk about that maybe at a later date as well. Students need systems. Sure, they need some structure. That doesn't need to be worship, you know? You don't need to create this theology and dogma around it for this to be effective. So what should you, the listener, do? Whatever it is you do. You can start with learning these basic human fundamental patterns. Well, what is a fundamental pattern is what a lot of people will ask. I already listed them all. As long as you include a tremendous amount of locomotor patterns in addition to the hinges, the pulls, the squats, right? The various forms of carrying. You know, as long as you explore locomotor patterns, you know, on your own and through, you know, sport, you're in a good spot. You got to question the flashy stuff. You know, I do a lot of interesting, weird things, but you know, I have real intention behind some of the odd lifts that I do or some of the exploration. But if it's just done to feed the algorithm and to give you a quick dopamine hit, you got to question that. And we've got to respect the things that may be outwardly boring, but internally they're lighting you up. You got to touch the edges of your understanding and your current capacity, always. Explore within that. And that doesn't just mean in your physical body. That's an exploration, you know, deep within your mind and your soul. And I believe everyone has a soul. Soul is a soul is a soul is a soul. And I believe we all need to kind of consider, a lot of us kind of lost that sort of soulful connection. When you find it, man, it's beautiful. So you got to listen to your breath. You got to sleep. You got to load. You got to sprint. You got to crawl, pull, push, hike, lift, shake, slow down, swim, all that stuff. And if you want to play with your fascia, sure, that's great. Just don't forget to pick up a damn barbell once in a while. Don't fear the thing, my God. So I'll offer a closing call, not as an appeal to authority, but to honesty and sovereignty in the kind of practice that leaves no part of any of you behind. So if you have made it this far, again, please like and subscribe and send it to your friends if you found value in it. I want to speak plainly, like man to man, man to woman, man to non-binary, coach to coach, teacher to student. I'm not above the noise. I've been in it. I've questioned my own philosophies, pedagogies, my own training. I've doubted my path. I've doubted it this week. I doubted it yesterday, late at night. I've gotten caught in the crossfire between performance culture and like spiritual bypassing. I've gone really deep into science and deeper still into suffering where I didn't realize it at the time, where I created an identity out of my pain. No one understood me. And I've climbed out again and again. But it wasn't by finding the right system, but it was by coming back to what's real and then learning to value that all of the stuff that I tried was a part of my journey and it all led me to my own truth. So here is the truth. I teach because I know how easy it is to get lost. Lost in injury, lost in identity, lost in a world of gimmicks and guarantees and overconfident assholes pretending they figured it all out. And I know the quiet desperation of people who just want to feel powerful in their bodies again or for the first time in their lives without being sold something, without being made to feel broken and fragile, without having to memorize someone else's vocabulary just to belong. So I really want to try and build something different for me to start my own creative pathway. I want to do this on YouTube. I'm already doing it on Substack and in every mentorship call that I take, because this isn't about content for me. It's about creating a classroom. I've always been fascinated by Gertrude Stein's salon in the 1920s, French society, right? All these brilliant different minds came together to talk to each other and challenge each other and maybe get a little bit drunk and smoke some cigarettes together, you know? I want this to feel like a place for people who want to think harder and feel deeper and move better, of course. Not just in their training, but truly in their lives. Because I also want to say, like, I've made the mistake of trying to be for everybody, but I'm not here to be liked. And that's not just to put up a middle finger. I just know none of us are for everybody. And I'm not here to be easily digestible or easily understood always. But I am here to teach and to remind people that movement is your human inheritance and it's not a trademark technique. You don't need to be a guru to lead. So if you're watching this and you're a young coach or an athlete or someone simply just trying to put yourself back together, stitch yourself back together after years of pain, this is for you. You don't need perfect answers. You do need real questions. You do need to stay in the arena of your life. Classic Theodore Roosevelt quote that a lot of people will use. Be that person in the arena. If people want to criticize you, fine. And I know that I've offered some critiques to some men that I have very little value for in this world because of what they've done, and the kind of people that they are. I may be able to keep a tremendous amount of love in my life, but if you can't express your own indignation and utter disdain, well, you're not being true to yourselves. Be true to myself. So to those of you, again, listening, you need to trust that load and love and curiosity will get you further than any Instagram method ever will. Chase algorithms. Let others posture with 17-letter words that they made up to confuse you. Let others create cults around language that only makes sense if you already bought their course. If it's behind a paywall, then they're usually not so honest. You build slowly. It's a process. It's all in the journey. You speak truthfully. You train deliberately and with intention and ask better questions. Don't go to ChatGPT all the time. Sit with it. Ask better questions. Marinate with it. Keep one foot in the science and one foot in the spirit and your whole damn heart in your process. So again, what I want for this work is I want this to feel more like, things I've valued in my life since some core memories was sitting around campfires where we were all thinking out loud and sharing stories together. And some of it was as silly as it could be, and some of it so sincere and serious. And I want my YouTube to be a place where we have this ecological entanglement of a devotional life itself. And maybe that involves strength and movement and philosophy or any ideas that I'm interested in, because it all matters. And I want my mentorships and my coaching experiences to be, if you're with me in more of this one-on-one stuff, it's to be a space where, serious seekers find their way again. The reason why I call it Wayfinder, because it's not with just one system, and it's truly with 1,000 experiments, 1,000,000, it's infinite. The reason why I love the game of movement is because Ido Portal said it years ago. It's like there's no real mastery of it. It's all in the gray. You can't truly master it. There's no finite way to move a body. You got to run this with total honestly and live it fully, because this isn't just the fascia that I was talking about today. It's about what it means to be alive in a body that feels, man. Repeat that. It's about what it means to be alive in a body that feels. So I'm not here to fix you. You don't need to be fixed. You need to become all of you. I'm here to walk with you through your pain, through your power, through the beautiful mess of becoming, because that's what I truly stand for. It's what I live for. It's what gives me purpose and love in this life. That's what I'm building. So we can let the gurus keep shouting and calling themselves demigods if they want to. I'll be over here, and I hope you'll join me, lifting, listening, teaching, telling our truth, our reality. So I hope you'll come and join me. Thank you so much if you made it this far. I love y'all. Again, please like and subscribe. It's so meaningful to me. Thanks for joining me on this journey. Long may it last. Take care.